Okay, great. So we're recording this webinar. And again, my name is Peter Smallage. I'm the New York State Extension Forester, and we're joined by Dr. Ben Spong. Before we get into the actual presentation, just to make sure for some of you who may be new to this interface, a couple of things to pay attention to. And this is relevant for the live presentation. If you're watching this as an archive, these 2 points won't be of value to you. But you will want to have access to the chat box. Most of you have done that. If you look in the upper right-hand corner of your window and you see the little bubble is gray associated with the word chat, please click on that, and that will turn that little bubble blue, and then you will have access to the chat box. So if you have questions for Ben, then you will ask them via the chat box. He will give you an audible response, but you will type your questions in via the chat pod. And please, when you send in a question, send it to all participants. And then that way the speakers see it as well as the attendees see it. If you only send it to all attendees, Ben and I never see that question. So send your questions to all participants. The second thing to call your attention to is if you go to the upper left-hand corner in the File menu and you select Save or Save As, and then you save the document, what you're saving is a PDF of the presentation. And you have the option of saving either as a PDF or a UCF. Save it as a PDF. People, unless you have some proprietary software, you probably cannot read a UCF file. So that won't do you any good to have that. Okay, I think those are the housekeeping details. As we're going through, if you do have questions, please type them into the chat pod. If folks have questions about sound, then I will see if I can help them. And I'm going to introduce Ben, and then he will have the floor, and I'll just mute my microphone and I'll kind of hover in the background. So Ben is a colleague from West Virginia University. Ben and I met through a group of extension foresters that gets together each winter in Pennsylvania Gray Towers. And we had never had this webinar series, had never had anything really specifically about forest harvesting. I think it's a very cool topic, and when I learned that Ben was the West Virginia Forest Operations Harvesting Specialist, I thought, this is great. So Ben agreed, and Ben has a high level of acuity with these internet interfaces. So I'm looking forward to a fabulous presentation. And with that, I'm going to mute my microphone. And Ben, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Peter, for having me and hosting this outstanding series. I'm a little jealous because I wish we had our own series that got as much participation as you tend to get on a regular basis. So I'm pleased to be able to present my little presentation here on harvesting operations and equipment. Let's see. Like to start a presentation, show a picture of myself so you know whose mouth is talking, and then the picture on the right there proves that I've been out in the woods at least one time for this photo. And I work as the Forest Operations Extension Specialist at West Virginia University, and our little website is right there, the ahc.wvu.edu. And we are the outreach arm of the School of Natural Resources at West Virginia University and provide services to statewide to all the population, landowners, industry, and anybody else that may be interested. And so with that, I would like to present a little bit of material about harvesting operations, a little outline of our presentation today. We'll go over kind of a background a little bit, some of the workflow, looking at the timber felling, the skidding and yarding, processing, loading, transportation. And then at the end, we'll take a look at a couple innovative approaches and innovative systems that are used around the world and locally as well. So with that, the original kind of intent of this program was to really provide kind of an overview of harvesting equipment and logging equipment that would help kind of connect the dots between a lot of the management decisions that are made by kind of forest managers and landowners that are looking to do something on their forest, and the kind of the forest operations and the logging side comes in when we actually get to do that. So here's where we actually get to go out there and make those changes that are actually implemented or started with the planning phase and kind of the forest management side on the back side of that. So anyway, today I wanted to go through this, and happy to answer any questions as you have them, and I'll probably cover most of those at the end of the presentation, but we should have lots of time to answer any questions you might have. I will say that I'll try to provide a balanced approach to this, given the kind of the wide range of areas that many of the participants in this webinar are coming from. There's lots of different environmental conditions and local conditions around the country, and I'll try to provide some ideas of what's going on in different areas of the country. But most of my work in the past few years has been very much focused in the Central Appalachians, in relatively mountainous terrain, and specifically in our West Virginia conditions here. My background is I grew up out in the west part of the United States in Washington State, and have work experience in Oregon, and so there we have West Coast experience as well, and I'm happy to talk about anything that you might have questions regarding that as well. So, to get started with our presentation today, we really wanted to figure out how to understand what are some of the opportunities for figuring out the best harvesting system for our situation. And there's really a number of different things that play into this. And this can start with things typical, like what are our local conditions? What's our topography? Do we have steep mountains? Are we flat? What's our weather like? As we get further into the Northeast, winter is a great opportunity to harvest because your ground becomes frozen, and we have very little impact on our soils. As we get further south and wetter conditions, our soils become weaker and we have a lot more mud and a lot more other issues. Or is there lots of water, wildlife, recreation? Are there historic sites around your property that you might be timber harvesting on? All of those play into helping us understand what are our options for figuring out the different harvesting equipment, which one of those is going to be the best option for our site. The next thing that we might want to look at is the forest and harvest characteristics. And what I mean by this is, well, what does our forest look like? Are we talking about 1,000 acres? Or are we talking 5 acres? The scale of that is going to make some big impacts on our choices. What about the tree size? If we're talking a bunch of trees that are 40 inches in diameter at breast height, that's one type of system, whereas if we're talking about lots and lots of small trees under 10 inches, that's maybe an opportunity to choose a different harvesting system that would be more appropriate for that. Then what type of harvest are we going to be doing? Are we interested in a shelter wood or a selective harvest, kind of a thinning where we're removing some trees but leaving some? Or are we interested in a regeneration harvest where we might be out there removing all of the trees from a particular site and trying to regenerate that stand to a different or a new forest stand there in the future? When we take a look at those options there, we also need to take into account what type of equipment and methods are available locally. In many areas of the country, certain equipment may not be very common, and it might be difficult to have somebody show up with a very specialized piece of equipment that may only be found in certain parts of the country. So you need to understand the general availability of different types of equipment, We need to take a look at whether or not ground-based systems or aerial systems. So are we going to move the wood across the ground, or are we going to lift up the logs and carry it through the air and try to get it into our landings and roadsides? And finally, personnel and workforce are another issue in this area. In West Virginia, this is a big issue. We have lots of personnel and workforce issues that we're trying to overcome with training, safety, and just availability. Right now, we have a huge shortage of loggers in our area, and so we're working to try to figure out how to get more people available, trained, and effective in the harvesting activities. And finally, there's some other primary constraints that kind of arch over many of these other ones. And these are, what are the finances associated with this? Each of the different harvesting systems have very different costs. They also have very different productivity levels. And so the amount of time that we have in order to carry out these activities is very important as well. And the last thing is, what kind of access do we have? Do we own a nice 3-lane paved road that going right into our harvest area, or do we have to cross 37 different landowners and on a very small right-of-way? And so based on the different types of access, you may or may not be able to get the different types of equipment into your particular site, and so that may be another constraint there. We put all these together, and we should be able to shake that around and figure out, well, what is that best harvesting system that's going to best suit all of the needs that we have for our site. So I wanted to take a look at the harvesting equipment first. And when we talk about harvesting equipment, we'll have a number of different places where each of the different types of equipment will be used, and many of these places have very different pieces of equipment doing each of these individual jobs. So if we think about this starting at the stump or the tree standing in the forest, and we're going to then move that tree through the woods to the road and then eventually to the mill. And so the first step here is going to be felling. We're going to be severing that tree and putting it on the ground. The next step would be skidding or moving that tree from the stump over to the roadside. The next thing might be processing, where we cut that tree up into individual logs and smaller pieces there. The next step would be loading, getting that log onto a truck. Then we have the truck moving the log to the sawmill. And the final step here would be coming back and making sure that the land is reclaimed in such a manner that we are going to protect that site from degradation over time with water and soils being left on the site there. So there are a number of different systems out there that are available in the literature, and so you can kind of look through these different types of spreadsheet or kind of flow diagrams that can help us understand what types of equipment might be appropriate for your particular job. So flow charts like this one have been developed, and they kind of help foresters, landowners, anybody else better understand the appropriate selection of equipment and systems for their property. This one here is specific to looking at a wheeled skidder, and then you can see there are a number of decision points that are listed on this flow diagram, and those are identified in the triangle or diamond shape diamond-shaped figures there. And so in this case, we have soil texture, soil moisture, slope, and terrain. Those are all the kind of decision points there, and we can work our way through that system. And at the end, we get a number that is associated with a risk level. And so in this case here, if we start out at soil texture, and we have a fine soil, that leads us over to the soil moisture here. And then if we have high soil moisture, it's then going to lead us to this risk level of 6. And if we look down on the very bottom left there, we can see that a risk level of 6 means that it is not recommended. So if we have fine soils that are really wet, we are probably not going to be using wheeled skidders. That's a very risky, not recommended solution. Well, and we can do the same thing to figure out, well, what is the most recommended? Well, uniform terrain, relatively gentle slopes, coarse soils, and that's really where the best situation is for this particular thing. So these diagrams can help people that don't have a whole lot of experience kind of come to terms with some of the different appropriate options and help them understand the different risk levels associated with the different choices. However, harvest planners and loggers will typically use their experience and knowledge from other harvest activities that they've done in the past in order to help them come up with their best solutions. So starting at the stump or the standing tree, the first thing that we need to do is talk about getting that tree down onto the ground and to start the whole process here. And probably the most common way to do that is through manual felling. And this is done throughout the world and throughout our country as well. And manual felling involves a chainsaw, usually some additional tools such as a wedge, which you see on this feller's belt here. They'll usually have an axe there to drive those wedges in. And then you'll notice a lot of orange clothing. There are personal protective equipment, including a face mask, earmuffs, high visibility clothing, chaps that are chainsaw proof, and a number of other pieces there. The chainsaw felling is very appropriate for a number of different sites, big trees, little trees, good for activities in thinnings as well as clear cuts. Steep ground, gentle ground, chainsaw is very, very flexible and very appropriate for use in many of those areas. The one downside is that it is a manual activity, or motor manual, I guess. The chainsaw has a motor, but the amount of effort and personnel and time to do this is much greater than some of the mechanized systems. So one of the downsides is that it's a little bit slower, but it is very flexible and can typically be relatively cost effective for most applications. The other kind of downside of manual felling is that it is typically one of the more dangerous activities in the forest. As you're toppling these very, very heavy and unpredictable trees, mistakes and bad things can happen, and sometimes are unpredictable. So the manual felling can be dangerous, and so that's one of the different caveats there for manual felling. On the other hand, the mechanized systems have really become much more popular in the past probably 20 years or so as technology has improved. We see two different mechanized felling systems here, and these are just two examples of different systems. There are literally thousands of different configurations and different carriers and different heads and different arms, and all this together the different options are endless almost. The two kind of big buckets or big areas of concentration would be the two that I've shown here. The one on the left is what we typically call a harvester, and it has a harvester head on it that is located right here. That harvester head can actually cut the tree at the stump. It then can lean or push that tree one direction or the other to lean it down onto the ground. It then has wheels that suck that stem through through the head there, and it has knives on it that remove the limbs as it's sucking it through the head there. While it's doing that, it's also measuring it. And so the computer system inside that the operator is using knows the preferred lengths of each of those logs, and as it hits those lengths and diameter that is sensing from the head there, it'll actually segment that log into, or that tree into a number of different logs based on the preferences of the sawmill. So super high tech. When you're sitting in these things, it's more like a jet pilot cockpit seat than it is kind of an old-fashioned bulldozer or something like that. It's very high tech, lots of computers, lots of different controls and mechanisms. On the other side here, we have what's called a feller buncher, and that's on the right, the yellow and gray machine. And the feller buncher, this machine typically does not do all of the processing. It is predominantly used just for cutting the tree down and laying it down into groups. So it's a feller buncher. So it fells the tree and it bunches them together so it's easy to pick them up and haul them out of there. And you can see here this one has grabbed a number of trees here, and it can keep grabbing those before it sets them down into a big pile. Feller bunchers are very common in West Virginia and in other parts of the East, especially in our hardwood forests that we have here. As you get into more of the softwood forests, you may see significantly more of the harvesters, which are the one on the left there, which with their long, tall, straight stems are much more appropriate for doing the processing with that harvester head. So a little closer a look. In West Virginia, we call feller bunchers, we call them Timcos. Timco is a brand name, actually. Timco was purchased, though, by Komatsu a number of years ago. And so there's no such thing as a Timco machine anymore. It's really a Komatsu machine. However, it's the generic term that most loggers in West Virginia call a feller buncher. And there's all sorts of different configurations. I'll show you the two most common that we see in our area here. The one on the right-hand side here is a feller buncher head that has a rotary disc or a circular saw disc. So you'll see that down at the bottom right here. There's a saw disc with a number of teeth on it. And that blade is basically pushed into the stump in order to cut it off of the stump. And then the accumulating arms, which are these guys up here, these grab the tree and hold it in place before it can actually lay it down. And this whole head will rotate 360 degrees, and they can do all sorts of different things with it. But the circular saw is the main component of this one here, and that's pretty important. On the left side, the yellow head here, this is more similar to a chainsaw system. It's mechanized, but it's a chainsaw that actually pops out of this little protective case here that I have the arrow pointing to. So a chainsaw will be activated by the operator in the cab of the vehicle, and a little saw will pop out and cut the tree off. And then the accumulating arms, very similar to the one on the right here, these guys right here, will close up and hold that tree in place until they can lay it down where they want it to. So these are the two kind of feller buncher types heads, and again, there's just an unbelievable variety of different manufacturers and companies making these, each one with slightly different characteristics and different things that they're absolutely perfect for. But these are kind of the broad categories that we see. Now, let's see. So once we get the tree onto the ground, so we've severed the tree from the stump and put it on the ground, we then need to figure out how we're going to get it to the roadside so we can then do something with it and eventually turn it into money. So kind of the most simple ways, or the most manual methods that we might think of for skidding, would be animal traction and manual methods. The picture on the left here is from my PhD research in Ethiopia, and with their operations, lots of issues as far as personal protective equipment and health and safety, but this is a very common way of moving logs around the world. And even here, we move logs manually quite a bit. We use different levers and tools to roll and get them to different places for easy access. But you also might see horse logging. Horse logging is not widespread or widely used in the country, our country, but there are a number of contractors out there that are using different animals for doing different activities in the forest and moving logs through the woods. In other parts of the world, in Philippines and such, you'll see water buffalo. In Thailand, you'll see elephants. So there's a bunch of different animals that are used for different skidding. Now, these are great options for kind of small-scale operations. They're typically of low production. We're not moving a lot of wood using these manual methods. There can be very significant labor costs associated with that. If we needed to hire a bunch of burly people to come out there and carry our logs, that would definitely cost quite a bit more. And it's typically limited to smaller wood. We're not talking about large old growth harvesting with most of these methods here. And both of these are very appropriate for both clear-cut type harvesting and thinning harvesting. Moving kind of up a technology level is to really what we'd see most common, especially in West Virginia and many areas of the country. The skidder is one of the primary tools for moving the log from the stump to the roadside. In fact, we call that process skidding, and we use a skidder to do that. So it's a very purpose-built machine specifically developed to move logs to the road. The two different types that we typically see are the cable skidder and the grapple skidder. And basically the skidder is exactly the same. It's what's going on the back end of it is the only difference between them. And I guess just to take one step back, the skidder, the wheels on the skidder don't actually turn. It's an articulated machine. So the front section and the back section are joined with a pin sort of in the middle. And so if it wants to turn, it needs to move the entire front of the vehicle one direction or the other. The wheels don't actually turn. It's the whole entire front section there. So that's good and adds to some of its flexibility, but it also does cause a little bit additional soil disturbance while it's being used like that. So if we look back at the rear end of these skidders, the one on the left is the cable skidder, and the cable skidder has a winch on it that's located immediately behind, right, kind of back in there. Can't really see it. And then it comes over a fair lead right here, and then it has a number of other wires that are attached to that main cable. The little wires on the bottom, these are called chokers. And these chokers are what are put around the logs, and you can get a number of chokers around a number of logs and haul them all in using the winch on the back of the skidder there. In contrast to that, we have the grapple skidder over here, and while there is a little winch that's kind of right in this little section here and there, the majority of the time you're using the grapple, which is the big yellow kind of grabbing arm on that skidder to back up to those logs, open the grapple, and then around them, then close it down so that it'll grasp the logs and be able to move them. The grapple is great because this guy that's sitting in the cab here, he's got nice windows, he's got an air conditioner, he's probably got XM radio, and yeah, he's feeling fairly comfortable no matter how cold it is outside or how hot it is outside. He's doing fine. Over here, this guy's got a nice little metal screen here that's protecting him from the elements. So on one of those negative 10-degree winter days, he's not a very happy person out there. Also, this guy on the cable skidder, he's got to jump out of the vehicle every single time, come around to the back of the vehicle, hook up the logs, then run back, get on the vehicle again, pull the logs in, and then continue on. On the grapple skidder, the operator basically stays in the vehicle almost the entire day. It's the rare occasion when he gets out and has to deal with something with the logs on his normal activities. So there is some definite differences between those two situations. The other thing is if you have people jumping off the vehicle, sometimes there's an additional opportunity to find or have injuries and other associated problems. And so sometimes if you have a completely mechanized system with a grapple skidder and then one of the felling systems where a person that is doing the cutting is always in a cab, in some cases you may be able to have lower workers' compensation insurance charges and different expenses associated with that because of the safer working conditions for the logger. The grapple skidder, the negative of that is that he has to back up to every single deck of logs. So he's required to drive up to every deck of logs that he wants to move, load it on his grapple, and then haul it in. The cable skidder, he can drive within 100-some feet of the logs and then pull the cable out and attach it to him. So he has a lot more flexibility and will actually have less ground disturbance because he's staying in kind of on a main trail and not having to drive and pick up every single log that's out there. So he's using the cable to get that extra reach that is not necessarily available with the grapple skidder. But again, I did mention that the grapple skidder right here does have a winch line on it, but typically those guys want to stay in the cab as much as possible, so they'll try to drive to them if at all possible. Now, when you get down into the southern parts of the U.S., you get some monster vehicles like this. This is what we'd call high flotation skidder. Again, this is a cable skidder here, I think. No, he's got a grapple on the back there. But in this case here, he's got extra wheels for extra contact with the soil. These are predominantly used in kind of swampy conditions where you might actually have to have very low soil strength, and you need the extra flotation in order to maintain your traction through those soils. Not something we'd see probably in more of the northern forests. These would rip up any residual trees in a thinning, really geared towards clear-cut harvesting in kind of the pine plantations of the south. Oh, sorry, there we go. Track skidders are the kind of the next group of skidders that we wanted to talk about. And basically, these are exactly the same as the previous skidders that we talked about. But these skidders, instead of having wheels on them, they actually have tracks, similar to a bulldozer. And these tracks can give you some additional abilities. They can work on slightly steeper ground. They can work on areas that have lower soil strength because they have wider contact with the soil. But they're slower, and so typically, we don't see most skidding where productivity is required. You'll see more of the push to be working with the tired skidders, but the track skidders definitely have an application as well. And again, both the cable type, like you see on the left, and then the grapple type, like you see on the right. The one on the left is kind of interesting. This was up at our research forest, and if you notice the rope or the wire, the rope here, it's actually a braided rope. It's a synthetic ultra-high molecular weight polyethylene rope that's braided, and we're using that instead of wire rope or cable to do all of the hauling on this. And this was a research project that we worked on for a while and has had really good success in West Virginia, and John Garland out in Oregon and the West Coast has had fantastic work and experiences with this as well. So then we can get to some more kind of niche market type stuff. These are some of the big pieces of equipment. The one on the left is called a Clam bunk skitter. Clam bunk skitters are huge usually, and basically it has an upside down grapple, and so the loading arm right here would be used to pick up logs and put it into the upside down grapple. It then closes the grapple and hauls just a huge load, and that's probably 1 or 2 truckloads of logs into the roadside. Now, you probably wouldn't do this on Grandma's 10-acre mixed hardwoods woodlot in rural West Virginia or New York or wherever you may be. Again, this is very commercial scale plantation, relatively flat ground types harvesting activities. The one on the right, it's not a clam bunk, it's sort of the reverse of that, but it sort of works in the exact same way, except that it's grabbing it as more of a grapple skitter. These are awesome machines, and there's really, really cool stuff to watch when you see these machines working. I'm seeing a couple comments here, and then the haul road. Well, they're working in the woods, and so that's not a haul road that they're working on. That's a skid road. So it's really just as wide as it's probably about an 8 to 10 foot wide skid road that wasn't necessarily potentially developed or rocked or anything like that, and should recover relatively quickly because of the large amount of ground contact of that vehicle. Lower pressures because of the tracks and the additional tires for that vehicle. Let's see. Forwarders are the last one that I wanted to talk about as far as different types of equipment. Forwarders are kind of a neat machine. You can sort of think of a forwarder as an off-road log truck. And again, these are working in the forest, moving the wood from the stump to the roadside. And this vehicle will drive out there, has kind of these uprights on this little trailer type thing. It's not a trailer, it's all integrated together. And it's got a loading arm right here. And this loading arm will then allow the operator of the machine to pick up logs and load up its bunks there. And then once it's full, it drives it into the landing at the roadside. And so these are pretty neat. Typically, they're used on thinnings and in clear cuts where you have relatively smaller wood, and also these are typically mixed up or matched up with a harvester, where what we call this is a cut-to-length system, where you're cutting all the logs or all the trees into logs in the woods to relatively short lengths, and then this forwarder can pick those up and very efficiently move significant amounts of wood to the roadside. So forwarders are often matched up with a harvester. Typically, we would not see this on super large diameter and really long logged type operations. If you had a 40-foot log hanging off the back of that, this would not be a very efficient machine. So forwarders are the last one that I wanted to talk about. So those are the general types of ground skidding pieces of equipment. And like I mentioned before, all of these are operating on skid trails or skid roads. These skid roads are going out into the forest. And these examples that I have here are from West Virginia. And West Virginia has a fairly unique situation, as we have very rugged topography and mountains. And we try to use many of these ground-based systems on the steep ground. Most of the ground-based systems are most efficient, where the slopes of the site are less than about 35%. And if you look at the one on the right there, you can see that's probably closer to 65 to 75% slopes. So in order to get that equipment to work on that area, they have to construct skid roads that are then following sort of the contours and allowing it to work on relatively flat ground, even though up and down from that skid road where it's pulling the logs from are significantly steeper. The one on the right-hand side is an aerial image from Google Maps, and this is an area in the central part of our state. And it almost looks like a topographic map, if you're familiar with a USGS topo map. It has all these lines that sort of look like the elevation lines, and that's really what they're doing, is they're building these skid roads in across the hillside in order to make the ground suitable for the type of equipment they've selected. Now, the one thing I'd say is that especially when you're building skid trails like this, these become a permanent scar on the landscape. These don't disappear when you're done harvesting or when the next forest grows back on this particular site. These will be there, and you'll find evidence of these for hundreds and hundreds of years before they kind of sort of disappear with kind of natural erosion and recovery of sites. These will be there and are definitely one of the things that are kind of an eyesore when you're talking about harvesting. They're also the point where most of the equipment is operating and where soil has been disturbed. And so most of the impacts from timber harvesting are directly related to the skid trails, and erosion or sedimentation off of the sedimentation from the dirt and soil material that's coming from those skid trails. So minimizing the amount of skid trails and keeping them narrow and keeping them as few and far between as possible, and also away from water sources, are some of the things that you can do to minimize some of your impacts to water resources on your logging sites. Now, of course, not everybody takes care of that, and these are some examples from West Virginia. Our state forestry people have provided these photos here of two jobs that they shut down. These were jobs that they were not spending good time, a lot of effort in maintaining their skid trails, working when soil conditions were appropriate, and what you see is significant amounts of mud and sediment and water. And over on the left-hand side, this is a live stream right here with this muddy water from the skid trails directly entering it. All of these things are against what we call in West Virginia the Logging Sediment Control Act. And so these are things that we need to try to avoid. If you're working on an operation and you see situations like this, it's best to get your operators to stop, wait for things, or come in there and either fix what the problem is, or wait for the soil conditions to improve, in these cases significantly, before they continue operations. Of course, at the end of operations, we'll need to come in and do some reclamation. Reclamation is basically trying to get that skid road to not be a liability into the future. So what we try to do is stabilize it as much as possible and deal with any water that might be rolling down that particular skid road. And the steeper the skid road is, the more attention that is required. And also very flat skid roads also need attention, but typically over about 10%, you want to spend a lot more attention on it, and things that are like exactly flat, you might want to spend attention on those. And in this case, in West Virginia, the logging laws state that you have to reclaim, and some of the reclamation activities that are done in our state are seeding and mulching. So you see the mulch material, this is all straw material, has been placed on the steep skid trails. Right down here, you'll see this right here, these are called water bars. And these are basically earthen dams that are dug out of the skid road that will intercept water that's flowing down the skid trail and then force it out here into the natural forest ground, or the less disturbed forest, where it can actually absorb in and not become something that we need to worry about. Now, the main idea here is that we want to manage water off of our logging sites in as small quantities as possible, and when it's not moving with any speed at all. So low velocities, low volumes. When you have that situation, you have very little opportunity for the soils to be removed from that particular site. So trying to get things secured on that site and stay there for the long term is what we're trying to do through these reclamation processes. So that's the basic kind of options, the main options for ground-based skidding. The other option is that, well, let's not drag those logs across the ground. Let's lift them up into the air and pull them into the landing through aerial logging systems. And so aerial logging systems are widely used in the West. They're not very widely used in the East, but I wanted to at least introduce you guys to some of these options if you're not familiar with them. The most common one, especially if you've watched the first few seasons of Axemen or anything like that, some of these reality TV shows that are ridiculously sensationalized, and our loggers like to watch it and then try to pick out all the safety violations that they would get a big fine for. So while there's some reality to it, there's a lot of sensationalism as well. But the cable systems that they're typically using, this is one example of a system, and just like everything else in logging, there's an ultimate number of ridiculous number of alternatives and kind of adaptations to this. But this is one of the most simple cable systems that we might see. This is called a live Skyline with a shotgun carriage. And so the live Skyline, that's the top wire here, and that top wire is hung out across or down a big hill here and tied off to a stump or something. Sometimes we can use other pieces of equipment or other things to secure that wire too on that side. And then there's a carriage, which is this guy right here. And it's basically two sheets of metal on either side with two kind of pulleys in between there. And that can travel up and down that Skyline. Now, the Skyline, in order to get it down, the carriage down to the ground down here, they have to slack the Skyline. So they'll let additional length out on that Skyline so it'll lower it down to the ground. Then guys that are on the ground called choker setters will come put those little chokers or those wires around the logs and then attach it up here to the carriage. And once it's attached to the carriage, what they'll do is they'll raise the Skyline back up into the air. So they'll pull it in. And then the second line here, the lower one, this is called the main line. And the main line is used to pull that carriage back up to the landing. Once those logs are at the landing, they'll lower the Skyline again, unhook them, and they have them on the roadside. Once they have them unhooked, they'll raise the Skyline again, and gravity will pull the carriage back out down here, and they'll pick up the next group of logs. So this is a very simple cable yarding system. The main component here is the yarder, which is the piece of equipment at the top of the hill that has the big drums or spools of pulleys, spools of wire rope that are used to pull the logs up and down the hill. So here's some examples of some of the different cable systems. This one here is a small trailer-mounted tower. This is a Kohler 301, I think is the model number. This one's actually owned, or was owned, by the Oregon State University student logging crew. It's powered by a Kubota farm tractor, so all of the power of this machine comes straight off of the PTO on the tractor. And you can see they can pull in some relatively big logs with this. It's very productive, and they can move a fair amount of timber out of the woods. You're just using this relatively simple machine to do this. So this is kind of small, not really huge production operated opportunities. The next option, kind of increase a little bit of the complexity here, is the Yoder. And other people may have other names for this, but basically we're utilizing an excavator or log loader type machine and sort of using it as a cable system. And in this case here, it's it's an opportunity to get this one has 2 drums, and it could operate very similar to the one that we showed the diagram of. The nice thing about this is that you don't have to have all those wires that help support the tower. You're just utilizing the piece of equipment, and so you don't have the extra rigging time to get things set up. So it's very fast, nimble, and great. One of the question here from Scott said, are cable operations effective in intermediate treatments? I assume you mean like a thinning or a partial cut of some sort. And many different configurations are. The best one for a thinning would be a standing Skyline system, where you have slack pulling capabilities. And so if we were using this Yoder, for example, this Skyline would stay completely fixed, so you would not raise and lower that. But you have in the carriage here, you have a motor that basically drops the motor has basically a small spool of wire rope that it can drop down to the ground and pull back up to the carriage. And so the carriage can stay way up in the air, but you have all this cable that you can pull out left or right of the main corridor that you're working on. And so you can go out 100 feet or more in some cases, and can be very effective. Now, the heavier the thinning is, the easier it is to do with minimal damage. If you're trying to take one log out of a very overstocked stand, you're going to ding up some of the trees along the way. So you have to definitely be a little cautious as you're going through your planning phase, trying to figure out what the best option is. But they can be very well utilized in partial cuts as long as you choose the right configuration. Now, I forgot, I have a couple videos here that I wanted to share, and one of them is associated with the Yoder. And this cable system here is fairly simple, but there's another way that the Yoder can be used, and it's called Tong Throwing. Now, these videos have some sound associated with them, and you should have a sound control, a little speaker with the 3 lines after it. You may want to mute this so it doesn't shock you when the sound comes on, because I can't control the volume. Everybody has to individually control their own volume as we go here. These are relatively short, but Tong Throwing is a very cool system, and I'll let us watch this, and we can come back and talk about it in a second. So if you can hear me, it's basically like fishing. Okay, so pretty cool. That is called Tong Throwing, and it's basically using a special Yoder type machine there with a winch line on it, and the operator basically spins it around like he's lassoing a cow, getting ready to lasso something in a rodeo. He throws that out, and then there's a guy or person standing out there in the woods, hopefully hiding behind a stump so that big tong, which are weigh quite a bit, don't hit him. So then once it lands, he'll jump out from his little safe spot, run over there, hook those tongs on the log, and then the machine will pull it into the landing there. Now, that's a different type of system using kind of the Yoder technology, and I think these are probably one of the more underutilized options in the East here. I think there's a lot of opportunities to see an extended use of these pieces of equipment around the East, especially in West Virginia here. You know, and I forgot, I have one other little video that kind of shows the Feller bunchers working. I forgot to do that. I didn't put my little example, or say show video now in my presentation. So here's the feller buncher. Again, this is the felling machine, and this one utilizes the big circular saw one. So again, if you need to, go ahead and mute this because there is some equipment noise associated with it. So if you can still hear me, this is an operation on our university research forest. You see the saw has just been pushed through the stump there, and now he's leaning it over to the direction that he wants it to and putting it on the ground, letting go, letting it complete that fall. Really fast. You can see how this is a lot quicker than the manual feller going out there, putting his notch in, back cut, clearing his escape routes. All of that stuff is not necessary. Here we just shove that big, huge circular saw blade through the stump and sever the log there very quickly. Okay, so we started with the little small tractor-based yarder, then we moved to the Yoder. We can get into some of the larger scale equipment, and again, these are very common out west in Oregon, Washington, California, Alaska. I'd say probably half or more of the logging is done using these different systems here. These are more production-based here. This setup here is using a Sling Yarder, so this extra tower part of the yarder can actually swing around, and so you can get your logs onto very small landings, so it gives you some additional flexibility. Next one is a kind of the large mobile yarder here. These ones are basically like their own vehicle. They can drive down the road. This is probably 110 feet tall. What you don't notice is this truck right here is an off-highway truck. These are only used for company-owned property, and you see the size of that log right there is ridiculously huge. So these are really for big wood, a lot longer distance yardings. We can yard out a couple thousand feet from a landing, and typically only used on the West Coast. And even on the West Coast, because we don't have timber like this as much anymore, the use of these large mobile yarders has decreased. In fact, a lot of these old yarders now have been bought up by New Zealand. They're buying all the old machines, taking them or shipping them across the ocean, rehabbing them, and using them in the plantations in New Zealand. And they really, really enjoy their cable yarding over there. So that's been a recent change in that. Next, the last cable yarder I have to show you, this was a brand new one that I just saw last year in Norway, and this one's built on top of a tank carrier made by Bombardier, and it's a brand new, it's one of the first new yarder to be designed and built in probably 40 years as far as a new design and everything. It's using all the synthetic ropes for all of its different lines. And this one here is using a running Skyline configuration, which is using a very different type of carriage, and has a whole bunch. This one has 3 or 4 different drums of cable on it, so it's a much more complex system, but very, very effective, and pretty cool that it's a brand new one that hasn't, it's not one of these that was built in the early 70s and just been kept in place for a while. So if we're not talking cables stretched across the landscape to haul the logs in using a yarder, the other option that we might have is that we could bring in a helicopter. And a helicopter is pretty awesome. I mean, you can sit there and watch a helicopter all day, but it's really fascinating to watch harvesting done with the helicopter. Typically, the helicopter comes with its own felling crew that is very good at knowing the weight of the logs, and they try to maximize the weight every single time that helicopter makes a trip into the landing. If they're spending more than about 3 minutes from their full cycle time, so picking up one log, dropping it off, coming back to pick up the next log, if that's more than 3 minutes, they're losing money. And so they need to do that as quickly as possible. And so these operations run super, super fast and are very, very productive. Unfortunately, along with that comes huge fuel costs, huge helicopter rental costs, and huge crew and labor costs. And so there's really only a few circumstances where this is an appropriate opportunity for harvesting. And again, you're not doing this on grandma's little woodlot with 5 acres. This is usually a lot larger scale. Many times it's our federal properties where you have very special protections that are necessary to protect different resources where these might be used. You don't have to have the same skid roads with these, so that's a nice advantage. But again, the cost is usually prohibitive for most harvesting activities. Oh, and I do have a helicopter logging little video here. So again, warning on the sound, so go ahead and mute your, this is on a field trip I took some of my students to a couple years ago. And there's the helicopter coming in. You see the logs dangling off the bottom there. He slows down right into the landing. And then there's a little bell where the chokers are connected. And once he gets them on the ground, he'll hit the button. It'll disconnect them. And then he takes immediately back off for the forest to pick up the next one. One of the interesting things here is that this is all done in the winter. And the reason this is done in the winter is so that in our broadleaf deciduous forest here, he can actually see the ground from there. And so he doesn't have to worry about having all those leaves in the way. So it really helps him, the visibility. Also during the summer, these guys are lifting water for firefighting activities. And so they have much less availability during the summer than they do in the winter. So it works out perfectly for our East Coast deciduous forest conditions. Okay. Uh-oh, I'm talking really slow here, so I will continue to go on, and I apologize if I've missed some stuff, but I'm plowing through. I got just a few more slides on some of the different processing capabilities here. So once we get things to the landing, we bring all those logs in, and the loaders will then grab the trees. These are the loaders. And they will then start processing, sorting, and loading those logs to the trucks. Processing, at least in West Virginia and parts of the South, and I think in the Northeast as well, is typically done with a slasher or a buck saw. These are relatively simple machines. It's basically like a big cutoff saw that the operator hits a button and the hydraulic saw comes down and severs the stem into multiple logs. These are very quick and very efficient and relatively inexpensive compared to having a guy out there with a tape measure measuring every single one of these and making a cut on the ground. When they do all that cutting and processing, typically we have lots of slash and lots of cutoffs. These are 2 jobs in southern West Virginia, and there's a lot of wood left out there. And that was all wood that was of no value, or it would cost more to remove it from the site than it would to be able to sell it. And so the value of that wood is very low. There may be some opportunities to improve use some of this material for biomass, energy development. If you ground it up, you could have some opportunities for some pulp and pellets and some of the other products that are coming out there. But there is much wider use of much of this slash and cutoffs, and firewood dealers love this type of situation when they can come out and have relatively easy access to this. And if you talk to some of our wildlife specialists, they'll tell you about how much these big cutoff piles like this are almost like condominiums for some of the different small wildlife. With all the nooks and crannies, it provides a significant amount of cover and habitat for a lot of those small mammals and other critters that like to live in those areas. When we get to loading, we can load the trucks. We typically will have a number of different sorts. So we'll have maybe in some cases in West Virginia, we'll have upwards of 10, 15 different piles of logs. for each different species and each different product of each of those species. And so peeler logs might go one direction, saw logs another direction, pulpwood another direction, and so each of those would have to have their own pile. And when the truck comes in, the loader operator has to find the right pile and match that with the right truck for the right person that it's being sent to. And so they will load that truck and send it out onto the highway. In this case here, there's a regular loader operator doing the activity. The other option is to use a self-loader, and these trucks have an actual loader built into them. So the truck driver can get out of the truck here, and then he moves up to a seat up here and can load his truck all by himself. And so he can get going, and he's very flexible. Although the downside of this is that because of the weight of the loader arm, I can't bring in as much weight of logs, and when I'm getting paid by the weight of the logs, that decreases some of the value that I might be able to have on my truck. Now, typical log trucks in West Virginia, these are two very typical ones. The one on the left is the most typical, and it has basically a single kind of long frame down the center there, and the uprights that the logs are put in. And then they're wrapped with a webbing wrapper to secure them on place. The one on the right here is more of a flatbed trailer that's been adapted and can be used for longer hauling distances as well. We see these types of trucks all over our state and are very, very interesting. So just to quickly summarize some stuff, and typically, at least in West Virginia, we're dealing with manual or mechanized felling. We're typically using a grapple skidder, trailer-mounted loader, so a loader that's on the landing, but it's on a trailer. It's not mounted it's not one of the self-loader log trucks. This is a trailer that just has a loader on it. And then we usually use a slasher or buck saw in order to do the processing. And this is very appropriate for most of the jobs in our state, both thinning and clear-cut operations. Even though the skitter is not really appropriate for the type of topography we have, if we build the skid roads, it then becomes appropriate. And they're most efficient when you have less than about 1,000 feet of skidding distance. And so the shorter the skidding distance is, the faster, more productive you can be, and lower the cost by the piece will be. So there are a number of rules and regulations that cover forestry, and most states have what's called best management practices. These are basically a set of preventative measures that help control soil erosion, and they're typically simple and inexpensive, so it's like put in a water bar on steep slopes or some different recommendations such as that. But basically it's moving surface water into undisturbed areas before it gains sufficient speed for soil removal. And most state BMPs are recommendations. These are recommended practices that can be done to protect soil. West Virginia has one of the stronger laws and regulations associated with forest practices in the east. We have what's called the West Virginia Logging Sediment Control Act, and our loggers have to notify the state that they're going to be harvesting. They have to have their company name and license posted on the site. They have to have a certified logger that has been trained in the best management practices, as well as CPR, first aid, and timber felling, and a number of other activities. And then the last thing, which is sort of the most important, is that it mandates or requires that they follow all of the best management practices. And so those best management practices, even though they're recommended practices, the Logging Sediment Control Act is the mechanism that then creates their requirement. If you're interested in looking at West Virginia's practices, you can download these from our State Division of Forestry at wvforestry.com. Tom asks, who certifies the loggers in West Virginia? West Virginia loggers are certified by the state. They provide the training or they provide most of the training. They don't do their own CPR classes, but they do the best management practices and timber felling activities. So that is the end of kind of the main part of my presentation. I do wanted to show you two quick little extra ways to look at different niche harvesting systems. And one of the ones that I'm most intrigued with right now is chute logging. And in this case, they're using culverts that they've cut in half and made these long chutes similar to like the old log rides and log flumes that they had in a long time ago. And I have a little video of this, and I think it's really fascinating. Again, you can mute your video player if you'd like. And here we'll play that. These chutes here this is done in Turkey. A colleague of mine there, this is one of his research projects. And again, this is mixed with either manual or mechanized methods. Here they're definitely manual. And they shove the log into the chute, and it goes down the hill and slides down to the landing. And they can do this in a number of different flumes, so they can send this down 1,000 feet, then move all the flumes down farther and go down another 1,000 feet relatively easily. So it's relatively quick, and again, no soil disturbance on this for the most part, and a pretty neat system, I think. It may be appropriate for some small operators in certain niche markets here in the States as well. Again, personal protective equipment and some of the loading activities is something that maybe we don't want to encourage in for the best safety in our areas here in the U.S. The other one that has been out there, and we've seen some recent redevelopment, is balloon logging. Back in the 70s, there was a couple companies doing balloon logging, and some pretty crazy stuff, and some of it was successful for a while, but it really fell out of favor. There was some Russian companies that were doing this a number of years ago, and even they, I think, have stopped. But you can kind of see it's a combination over here of a yarder connected to a balloon that does all of the lifting activity there. So that's kind of neat. Just recently, Boeing has come out with this skyhook technology, which is basically a balloon that has neutral floating capacities. So it basically holds itself up in the air, and then it has four basically little helicopters on this side there that it uses for steering. And so the balloon lifts the entire balloon, but it doesn't do any of the lifting of the logs. So there's no weight necessarily on the balloon because it's already up in the air. And then each of those little helicopter rotors will do the lifting and also control moving the logs into the landing. So sort of a mix between balloon and helicopter logging in this case, and sort of a neat technology. Of course, I think this is more of a proof of concept right now. And so that's the last slide that I have. I wanted to thank you guys for your attention, and I apologize for going a bit over, but I'm here for a number of questions. If you have additional questions you'd like, I have my contact information here, and I'm happy to answer those at a later date as well. But I guess we'll go through the different questions here that we have, and I'll try to see if I can catch most of these. Or Peter, do you have a recommended way to attack those?
First of all, Ben, thank you. This was a great presentation. I mean, I love the way that you organized. I mean, harvesting lays itself out very in a linear sort of way, a sequential way to the compartmentalization of systems. And so that was, I learned a lot, and I think the audience did as well. So I appreciate that. We have. There's a few questions that you got some of them coming through, but then there are a few that came up. I guess I'd like to, as the host prerogative, I'd like to ask a couple of questions that relate to economics, which would have been more, and it'd be a higher level presentation, so I wasn't expecting that you would cover those, but they came to mind. One of them is, you were illustrating a continuum between mechanization and productivity or outputs. How do you determine, I mean, it's going to vary from system to system, but how do you determine your sweet spot on profitability? Because certainly you get more production the more mechanized you are, but you have higher costs the more mechanized you are. So is there a process that operators will use, or is there a kind of an industry mentality that bigger is always better? How do they approach the profitability sweet spot?
At least in my experience here in West Virginia is that they don't. What they have is their set of equipment, and they manipulate that system to work best for their whatever the situation that is thrown at them. Now, the different timber purchasers and sawmills and the people that are hiring the loggers will often hire the person that has the best suite of equipment that they think is appropriate for that particular site. But in most cases, I don't see a lot of analysis or understanding of the costs associated with their activities. In fact, that's one of our biggest issues right now. We have this logger shortage, and we're trying to identify some of these opportunities to encourage recruitment into logging. And the biggest barrier is kind of business management, understanding what their costs are associated with their productivity and their opportunities. And so we're spending a lot of time right now working with loggers, trying to help them understand what their costs are, how they might maximize their productivity and minimize their cost. And it's something that most loggers don't get into logging business to spend time looking at spreadsheets. And,
right.
So unfortunately, that's a very difficult thing to get them to do. But the reality is that the bigger the job is, the bigger the property is, and the bigger the equipment is, and the more wood that you can move and the faster you can do it, all that will lower your costs until your costs are exorbitant. If they're using different types of equipment that are especially expensive or breaking down all the time, or different scenarios like that, those are when the costs really start skyrocketing. And so it's really matching kind of the size of the plot or the activity with the number of different pieces of equipment, or the kind of the combination of different types of equipment. And like I said a number of times, you wouldn't bring some of these very industrial sized pieces of equipment like that Clam bunk skitter. You wouldn't bring that out to somebody's woodlot to do the harvesting out there. So there's a lot of leeway within there, and there's things that the loggers can do on site to help minimize that cost. But again, matching their equipment to the size of the job is probably one of the easiest ways to keep their costs, or find where that sweet spot is. And yeah, but again, they're using their experience. I made a lot of money on this sale, a type of sale that was like this last year. This one looks a lot like that. I think I'll use the same kind of setup this time. And a lot of times we're using a logger that only has one set of equipment, so they don't have much choice, with the exception of going out and buying a $500,000 harvester or some other specialized piece of equipment. So it does give you a lot of opportunities to optimize, but at this point, probably only the very successful loggers are actually spending the time to do that.
Okay. Well, I have another question, but I'll save that. There are some folks here that have some questions. I'm remembering one. I think Tom Ward wrote it in about some small scale equipment, maybe some skid steer based logging equipment. Is that that's kind of taking things in the other direction?
Oh, absolutely.
Any comments on that, or observations related to that?
Yeah, there are a number of companies out there that are making small-scale logging equipment. And again, these are for more kind of those niche markets, small landowners, farmers that may be doing some of that work themselves and want to either rent or buy a small piece of equipment, or somebody that wants to service directly those markets. There's some people in Ohio that are specifically doing that with some of these very small skidders, about maybe half or three-quarter size of a normal or a normal small skidder that's used industrially. They've cut the size of those down significantly more, and so there are a number of places out there that are making that equipment. A lot of the technology and innovation in these areas are coming from our Scandinavian countries. And so if you're interested in finding the cutting edge of all this stuff, it's definitely coming from the Nordic countries in Europe. However, our big John Deeres and Cats tend to buy up all those companies then, and so they become American, but the technology is still coming from there. But there are small-scale arches. If you looked back at the horse logging situation, they have a small arch there. This is all equipment that could be used with an ATV, also used with a small skid steer. Even farm tractors can be hooked up to this. Again, I caution when you're talking small-scale operations like that, many of the pieces of equipment don't have the same personal protective equipment that industrial-sized equipment has. So if people are doing ATV skidding with an arch here, they don't have the same rollover protection and other things like that. So it's one of these things where you can do it. It's not always the safest or most productive, but oftentimes it is something that a smaller landowner can get involved with.
Okay. And so Carlin asked about studies that have been conducted on the cumulative effects, either positive or negative, of skid roads in West Virginia with regard to habitat fragmentation or early successional habitat or forest regeneration. So you talked about, kind of the rough topography of West Virginia. Parts of, other parts of the Northeast have, and you have to have skid roads, and so are there positive or negative aspects to those?
I would say most of the aspects would be negative, but those would be mostly because you're disturbing the soils and loosening them up, fluffing it up basically, and making it able to be eroded. As far as habitat and how that plays on different species, I'm sure it has some barriers to very non-mobile species, snails and things like that, that may be impacted by those. I'm not aware of the actual studies that have been done with that. It is something that I'm sure there's I know there's been work done on skid roads looking at many of the different characteristics of it, but it would have to unfortunately go back to the databases and see if I could find out which one of those were specific. But in general, in my opinion, especially in West Virginia, there are way too many skid trails, and I'd like to see significantly fewer of those. And they're definitely a scar on our landscape here. And so if we can minimize those at all possible, I'm always looking for ways to do that.
Mm-hmm. So with the skid trails that are installed, and it's hard to make judgments on skid trails maybe that were installed in the 60s or 70s or 80s before there was a lot of effort put into best management practices. The current skid trails that are being put to rest with good best management practices, are those going to be, I'm assuming that those are going to be relatively, remain functional for the next harvest. So you have, you do a regeneration harvest in 2001, and then 60 years later or 40 years later, you're doing some intermediate thinnings, and then some, so as you get into this, the regrowth forest, are those skid trails, I mean, you may have to open them up, but they're going to be lower costs for reestablishing them.
No, and the best case scenario is that you plan your skid trails on your site to be a permanent part of the transportation system there. If you can concentrate all of your disturbance on those skid trails in perpetuity for every entry to that forest, then that's going to be a lot better for that particular site. The caveat to that is that with technology, things sometimes change, and so those skid trails may not be in the right location. So, for instance, if we look back to our early turn of the century logging history, all of our roads were right next to the creeks, and so and the skid trails and landings were all next to the creeks because that's where you have had easy construction access. Now, that may not be the best place if you're trying to do cable logging. It's often better to be at the top of the hill. And so with that, your existing infrastructure might not always match the technology for logging in the future. Skid trails should be relatively safe and usable for continuing entries. That technology probably will not change dramatically in the next 50 to 100 years. But if you can plan to reuse them, that definitely is very, very a good practice to do, and should be encouraged whenever possible. And it doesn't take much effort at all to open those up. I mean, they're natural dirt surfaced or soil surfaced, so it's basically smoothing out the water bars and moving on, start your logging.
Okay, so Pat McGlue has a need here to find, or maybe you have some recommendations or some observations or things you've learned about from Scandinavia about small equipment that is nimble, low impact on the residual stand, low operating cost, basically being able to convert what's a pre-commercial thinning into a commercial endeavor. And when you find that, Tom Ward wants the same thing.
Well, I'll send you my answer here in the mail. That is kind of the silver bullet there for a lot of things, and especially as we talk about improving some of the biomass access to kind of that low value material, whether it be in a pre-commercial thin or where it be is residue or other things that is cost prohibitive to get right now, or it has damage to the existing stand. In Oregon and Washington and parts of Canada and Scandinavia and such, they have been very successful with the cut-to-length harvesting systems. And if you remember, that's this guy on the left-hand side here. With that piece of equipment, it looks like a huge piece of equipment, but it can be very nimble. We had seed tree progeny sites that we were thinning in Oregon using a piece of equipment very similar to this, and it was very effective and was surprisingly nimble in there. Of course, it takes a good operator and good planning to make the reality of that actually come out at the other end as well. So operator skill is one of those things that is very, very important when you're dealing with the mechanized felling systems, especially in a thinning. In a clear cut, it doesn't matter as much, but in a thinning, if you're having an operator mark up every tree in there, that's not acceptable and not something that they're going to be asked back the next day for.
Mm-hmm. Okay, then we have a question about rollover protection. You were talking about some of the smaller scale equipment, and well, there's a specific question about size and length of logs, but in general, is rollover protection something that you can ignore if you're working with smaller sized logs, or is it something you need to be attentive to regardless? If you're moving equipment in the woods, do you need to be attentive irrespective of log size?
Yeah, I think the log size, you should always be aware of it. And again, it's probably more specific to the amount of turns you're making and the steepness of the trail or topography you're going across. But it's you should be aware of it. However, you don't necessarily there's a lot of people that use it, that skid small wood like that without rollover protection, but it is something that you're putting yourself at increased risk than somebody that has rollover protection. So it's one of those judgment calls, but yeah, there's a point of over-engineering and going complete overkill on stuff, but a lot of times when something happens that is unexpected and you roll over and you don't have that protection, you go, oh, what was I thinking? So it's just managing your risk is the main thing there.
I guess if you roll over, you hope you have the opportunity to say, what was I thinking? So,
absolutely.
So, and that covers part of a question I think that Todd had rather, but he had a follow-up. If you can talk a little bit more about the poly logging rope.
Yeah, there's the rope that we were using is a rope called Amstel Blue. It's made by a company called Sampson I think they're out of Bellingham, Washington. John Garland at Oregon State University when he was still there. He was the extension harvesting person there. Did a ridiculous amount of research and studies on that, on the different characteristics of the rope, end connectors, splicing, and all sorts of different stuff with that, and has really pushed its use in logging forward significantly. We've done a little bit of work here in West Virginia. We've provided it to our school forest, and they laughed at me when I first gave it to them, and then they asked where they can get more of it. And so they really, really like it, and it's really been a real nice addition to their equipment fleet. The greatest thing about it is there's a number of great things about it. One, it weighs about 1/7 of the weight of the wire rope, so it's very light. Two, it doesn't have any jaggers, so it doesn't, when a strand out of the wire rope breaks, it basically becomes this little puncture wound making piece of wire, and so that's very dangerous for people holding it. You don't have any of that with this rope. And three, it's flexible and easy to splice. If you remember back to the old carnivals in the early 60s, 70s or whatever, they had these Chinese finger traps. That was probably not politically correct, but these little finger traps where you put your fingers in both ends, and when you pull on it, your fingers can't pull out of it because the rattan or whatever it was made out of compresses on itself. And the wire, or this polyethylene rope, does the same exact thing. So if you basically stick one end of the rope through the middle of the other side of the rope, when you pull on it, it basically splices itself together. So if it breaks, you shove one end in the other, and you can start logging again in 5 minutes later. So it's really, really fantastic. And diameter for diameter, it's the same strength as wire rope. So that's really a nice benefit as well.
Mm-hmm. I have that on I have an arch that I use with my ATV, and I have that poly rope on there, and it's really, for all the benefits that you say, it's really nice. So,
yeah, it does cost more.
Yeah, but like for me, I'm only buying 50 feet of it every decade, so
exactly.
I can see that. So, is there a general rule of thumb? Herb wants to know if there's a general rule of thumb about whether a Timco harvester is less damaging to a residual stand than hand felling, or what are the? You've mentioned some of the things like residual stand density and things like that, but what considerations would reduce would move you towards hand felling versus mechanized felling to reduce stand damage?
The key factor there is that whenever you have a mechanized piece of equipment out there, that's another vehicle traveling through the woods. A lot of our damage comes from wheel rub or track rub against trees. Again, the less dense the stand is, the easier it is to it is easier to avoid those trees. The more dense it is, harder it is to do that. So in general, I think the risk of damage is higher whenever you have mechanized felling, especially with like a Timco or some sort of harvesting equipment in there, because you're adding both the felling equipment as well as the skidding equipment, whereas hand felling, you just have the skidding equipment in there. Now, there is some opportunities for improved protection of the residual stand, because with the felling equipment that you have in there, typically you can directionally fell or move trees to an area that's not going to damage any other trees. So I can pick up the log and turn it around and then lay it right in my skid trail if I want, and it's not going to have any damage to any other tree in the stand there. If you are going to see it, if you're just felling it manually, you have to take into lots of different considerations as to which direction that tree is going to go. And if you want it to go a different direction than where it naturally wants to go, you have to spend a lot more time and effort. And it is slightly higher risk when you're felling in that manner as well. So you can, and in the end, the key component here is operator skill. And if the operator is skilled and is taking the time and effort to protect the residual stand, we've found that you can have very, very good results using mechanized felling.
Okay. Sorry, I'm just typing questions and responses to CEUs.
No problem.
So just to verify or to clarify that, so when you registered, for the participants who are looking for continuing education credits, when you registered, you had the option to select a link for licensed forester or SAF certified forester or master volunteer or something like that. So that covers the CEU. So I'm assuming that everybody, you typically have to go to get, you go through the registration page in order to get in. If you didn't, for some reason, didn't have to go through that registration page, I'd like to know how you got in here. And also just, you'll have to send me an email. I put my email address there, PJS23, and email me and I can add you to that CEU list. So the download for the presentation, if you want to obtain a copy of this presentation, go to the File menu, and you should do it quickly because we're going to be signing off here soon. Go to the File menu in the upper left-hand corner, go to Save, and then Save Document, and that will give you the option to save a PDF. You can save a UC, actually the option for UCF or PDF. Select the PDF option, and you can save a copy of this presentation. There's no audio with it. You'll just see the text and the pictures. So with that, I think, Ben, you have answered all of these questions. You've done a great job. I really had a lot of fun with this presentation. I appreciate the time and effort you put into putting this together. So I'm going to turn off the recording and